thank you for that wonderful introduction. And now let's go ahead and get started talking about a little bit of my aim 1 and 2 and what I'm currently working on at my dissertation. So we're going to be focusing on school garden sustainability and what this means for both research and practice. Sure, I got my right. There we go. Okay. So I want to begin first with an analogy so we can get everybody in the room sort of on the same vibe as far as what it means to run a school garden. So first, let's think about what we would say for how a lab is run as an example. So if you have a lab, well, of course, you need money and a lot of it to be able to conduct your experiments. You need the resources and equipment. And you also need people that are trained to work in your lab properly, right? We don't want people who don't know what they're doing in the lab space. And then, of course, one of the biggest factors is you have a PI who needs to have buy-in to the type of work you're doing. And they also need buy-in from funding organizations like the NIH or NSF, for example. So that way you can continually run your lab. And all this is done, of course, under very strict conditions. So that way you get optimal outcomes. So you can prove your mechanism or have your proof of concept that can inform animal studies or even human clinical research. And so we can think of a garden like a very large non-sterile lab setting. So of course, you're going to need money not only to build a garden, but keep the garden running. You need resources that go into the garden, like seeds, for example, so you can plant your crops. And you need people who are trained to work in the garden and take care of the garden so it keeps running. And still, you need buy-in for your garden. And in this instance, it would come from administrators or principals, and also from funding agencies like Whole Kids Foundation or Sprouts Healthy Communities Foundation that give money to support school gardens. And in this instance, all of this is done so that way children can get the benefits of school gardens. And this is really important. And again, I want to highlight the necessity. So why is it important to even research school gardens? Well, they are increasing in popularity. And while the true number of school gardens in the United States is not known, we have some data from the Farm to School census that shows that from 2019 to 2023, school gardens have increased 85%, from a little over 7,700 in 2019 all the way to 9,000 in 2023. So if we do some math, okay, if we have just bare minimum 9,000 school gardens that exist in the United States, and on average, there's around 478 students per K through 12 school in the United States. That's over 4 million K through 12 students that can be reached by school gardens every day. And we know that school gardens do work to improve health outcomes in children. And so this is just a high-level overview of results from Texas Sprouts, our cluster RCT that you all are very well familiar with. But from that study, we found that school gardens can increase vegetable intake, can improve gardening and cooking self-efficacy, improve diet quality, decrease ultra-processed food intake, like we talked about last week, and increase minimally processed food intake, improve glucose control, and even reduce LDL cholesterol. And despite the benefits of school gardens, there are significant barriers to their use. Some of the most commonly reported being time it takes not only to maintain the garden, but for people to feel like they can work in the garden, teachers feeling like they don't have an appropriate curriculum to teach in the garden, or feeling like they don't have the knowledge to adapt their existing lessons for outdoor learning. And then, of course, one of the biggest barriers is funding. So money to build a garden, to sustain the garden, and to ideally pay someone to be able to take care of it in some capacity. And so that leaves us with a lot of questions that remain for what are actual best practices for the implementation of school gardens. So we know that school gardens work and they are beneficial to children. We saw this with Texas Sprouts, but really the question is, okay, after you build the garden, then what happens, right? And so it's more about how do we sustain gardens in schools, and what even contributes to thriving gardens? And these were really lingering questions that we had after Texas Sprouts ended, because there really isn't much data in this space. And so that brings us into aim one of my dissertation, which is looking to assess factors that contribute to thriving school gardens in the domains of physical condition, school integration, community involvement, and resources and support. And so I'm going to talk about our survey, our school garden sustainability survey that we developed and used in our lab. And Burgermaster, this probably looks very familiar to you. So we based our survey on the Green Tool for Resilient School Gardens. And this tool has 4 domains that are outlined. So resources and support, physical garden space, student experience, and the school community. And as you go outside of the wheel, you have just your sort of bare minimum of what's needed for a school garden to function. And then as you go inwards towards the wheel, you have what makes the components that make a garden more well integrated or institutionalized into the school. And so we use these components to build the questions that are in our survey. So as I mentioned, there's those 4 domains in the green tool. So we have these 4 domains that are in our school garden sustainability survey. And we have questions that pertain to each of these. So under physical garden, we ask questions about the attributes of the garden, who maintains the garden, what type of condition is it in, student teacher experience. So how is the garden used? What subjects are taught? Any curriculum that's used? School community, the type and amount of volunteer support, and resources support. So anything dealing with in-kind donations, monetary donations, resources received, any support that's given to sustain the garden. And we first implemented the study here in Texas. So we had 109 schools that completed our survey, and we had a panel of experts that went out and actually rated the gardens as thriving or not thriving based on the physical condition, school integration, and garden usage. And what we found from this initial study was that thriving school gardens were 3 times more likely to have funding, 4 times more likely to have a garden committee, and 12 times more likely to have a supportive administration. And so we expanded our questionnaire, and it's now delivered online because we wanted to know not only about what's happening in gardens in Texas, but across the United States. So right now the survey is on Qualtrics. It's open year round, so anyone at any time can take the survey. They consent for their data to be used in the research, and it takes about 20 to 30 minutes to complete. And so, as I mentioned, the survey has those 4 domains. And rather than having a panel go out and rate these gardens, instead, respondents self-rate each domain. So after they complete each section of questions, there is a domain rating question before they move on to the next. And so here's just an example of what the rating question looks like for the physical garden condition, and it ranges from well-maintained all the way to unmaintained. So about the sample that I'm going to talk about for results, this is an aggregate of data from August of 2021 through May of 2024. It excludes non-school gardens, responses from international gardens, and those who filled out the survey for multiple campuses. We also limit it to those who completed at least 85% of the survey and, of course, consented for their data to be used. So that left us with 406 teachers, administrators, and garden coordinators from 37 states and Washington, D.C., with the most responses being from Texas, followed by D.C., and then California. And here's an overview of the survey respondents. So again, this is just the majority for simplicity's sake for the presentation. So most reported that their main campus role was teacher or school staff from public elementary schools that were not Title I. And for our Title I classification as yes or no, we used whether the students, more than 50% of students were eligible for free and reduced price lunch at time of the survey. And then most respondents said that for their level of garden involvement, they were the garden coordinator for their school, and gardens ranged in age, but most were between 4 and 10 years. Now let's talk about how we define a thriving garden for the purpose of this analysis. So we had those 4 domain rating questions, and if 3 out of the 4 were well-maintained or good, so excellent or good, then they were categorized as a thriving garden, otherwise not thriving. And so from that categorization, we had 89 gardens that were thriving, and we had 275 that were not thriving. And we had 42 that were missing, so they either left a rating question blank or they selected unknown, meaning they didn't have enough information to rate that particular component of the garden at the time. So they were excluded from analysis. So from that categorization, we have our overall garden status, it's thriving or not thriving. And then we use those domain questions to look at what predicts a thriving school garden. And so I use logistic regression for this analysis, and these models are adjusted for Title I status, how old the garden was at time of survey, and the school classification. So whether they were public, private, or charter school. And I have my regression coefficients exponentiated in these tables, so you'll see odd ratios. Okay, so for predictors of thriving gardens, I have highlighted here just our significant findings, again, for simplicity's sake for this presentation. So having any garden work days compared to none, you had 2 times higher odds to be thriving. But when we actually broke it down by number of days, only 6 or more garden work days significantly predicted a thriving garden. So if you had 6 or more garden work days each year, you had 4 times higher odds to be thriving. For a number of subjects and grades that are taught in the garden, so for each additional subject taught or each additional grade taught, the odds to be thriving increased by 23%. For individual student use compared to a student that uses the garden once or twice a year, students who use the garden once or twice per week, there's almost 5 times higher odds to be thriving. And we found that as the number of volunteers in the gardens increase, so does the odds to be thriving. Furthermore, for trainings attended, so those who reported 4 or more trainings attended, you had about twice the odds to be thriving. For administrative support, and this is huge. Okay, and I do want to highlight this. So for a level of administrative support, for those who had high compared to little to none, you had almost 45 times higher odds to be thriving. And this is correct. I sat down with a statistician. He calculated this by hand and said, yes, this is what your data says. So I know it's very crucial, and we know this already intuitively. And then for number of hours that the garden coordinator works to maintain the garden, as the number of hours increase, so do the odds to be thriving, especially with someone who is full-time, so 30 to 40 hours per week, almost 6 times higher odds to be thriving. And then for any resources received in the past year, twice the odds to be thriving. And then similarly, as budget for the garden increased, so the odds to be thriving. So what does this mean for practice? How would someone take this information and use it to improve your gardens? Well, really, we definitely want to enhance and foster administrative support. And this can be sort of gray because what does that even mean exactly? Well, examples of this could be that the principal can set aside time at faculty meeting for teachers to discuss the garden. They can help support or promote the garden in back to school nights. So if they interact with parents, for example, and then they also could be able to actually set expectations for garden usage as an option. We really want to recruit volunteers, but we want to use them strategically. And the reason why I say this is the last symposium that I did that I'll talk about a little bit later, we had some impact grant partners that presented with me, and they really wanted to emphasize that, say, for example, if you have a parent that wants to volunteer in the garden and they're an email marketer, then maybe it would be good for them to help improve your garden communications as an example. Or if you have a parent that's a carpenter, maybe they can help repair or build beds. Increasing the number of annual garden work days, so we know 6 or more is optimal. Increasing the subjects and grades that are taught in the garden. Attending at least 4 trainings related to school gardens, and establishing a consistent budget for the garden. And again, this can definitely be a gray area, but some suggestions could be to really emphasize funding partners that can help fund the garden, or maybe even fundraising with PTA as an example. And then hiring a paid garden coordinator. And I do want to highlight again that a lot of these findings are, really intuitive. Like, it's not surprising that we see these results. But it's important to actually have this on paper, so that way people or stakeholders that work in school gardens can take this to the administrators and say, hey, this is how we can improve our garden. These are goals or tangible goals that we can work towards. And also, Sprouts Healthy Communities Foundation, who's one of our funders, they actually want to use the results from this study to help inform how they decide to give grant funding to gardens that apply for their funding. So Sprouts gives away $10 million a year. They want to make sure that the money that they're giving to these programs is for programs that are going to actually move the dial or be successful. And then additionally, they would also like their grantees to take the survey as well. So again, we can see and assess how the gardens that they're funding are improving, if at all. And then I do want to note that this manuscript is currently in revision at JNEB. So we'll wait to hear back from them. Okay, I'm gonna take a sip of water real quick. No, it's just sparkling water. Ultra processed, we don't know. Maybe, maybe not. Okay.
The answer is probably yes.
It's unsweetened.
But it matters.
Yes, yes. All right, so I want to segue now into talking about my aim too. So we're focusing more on the people that are, who is working in the garden exactly, and money surrounding this. So typically, most school gardens are started by interested teachers or parents, or what we would call a garden champion. And in fact, one study reports that over half of people who are maintaining the garden are the champion or just kind of a random group of people. And, you know, if we have just one person who's taken on this whole responsibility to build and maintain this garden, what happens when they leave? Right? There's sort of this vacuum of responsibility for who's going to take care of this thing, who's going to maintain it, how do we keep getting kids in here, how do we schedule classes? And so there really is a need for support for school gardens, especially when we think about role responsibility and actually distributing this work. And we found this even with the Texas Sprout study. So, you know, we can go in and do a study and put 16 gardens in the schools, but we don't just want the study to end and then leave with no follow-up or continuation to help support their use. And this was one of the inspirations behind our Eden Lab developing our Sprouting Teachers programming. And specifically, I'm going to talk about our garden leadership programming today. And this was done so that we could establish garden committees, have that role responsibility designated, so that way these gardens can be sustained and used in the schools. And that's important because a lot of times, as I mentioned, gardens are maintained on a volunteer basis, if by anybody really that's designated. So this I just want to highlight from our first initial study that we did in Texas. So even if you had a garden coordinator, most were reporting that they were unpaid. So it's someone that's a volunteer. And we see this with similar studies as well, where they're either paid or not very many are paid. And then when we're thinking about who it is that's working in the school to maintain these gardens, it's teachers. So it's teachers that are being asked to take on this extra role of taking care of the garden on top of all of their other teaching responsibilities. And I think there are people who have taught before in this room shaking their head, like, yes. And so we know that teachers can get incentives from other work, like, for example, teaching robotics classes. So it may not be, in this instance, feasible to pay to have someone work 40 hours a week to maintain the garden. But at the very least, can we give extra compensation for that time that's spent taking care of the garden? And so that brings me into my aim 2, which is looking to assess the effect of our Sprouting Teachers Garden Leadership Program with and without stipends on some of these implementation and sustainability outcomes. And before I get into it, I do want to give a nod to our Eden Lab team. So most everyone is familiar with Michelle Hobbit-Cooper in here, but we also have 4 additional full-time staff that work in the lab and deliver this programming to schools in Texas and in other states as well. And I do also want to give a big shout out to them because I'm in their inbox a lot with questions and verifying, and even with the study, making sure who did their surveys, who didn't do their surveys. So if they're on Zoom, shout out to y'all, you're amazing. And I'm just going to show a snippet of the data for my analysis, but I really want to highlight the impact that this programming is having. And we've been doing this for 7 years. And so since 2018, we've had over 371 teacher trainings, over 120 garden leadership committees trained and formed in 78 unique schools, 10 states, with estimates of over 65,000 students impacted by this work. And so here, yes, it's a lot of work. They are amazing. So here's an overview of the Garden Lead program. So participants have to apply to be in this programming, and they have to meet the following requirements. So they have to have an existing school garden. They have to have documented administrator support. And so in writing, they need to have that their administrator knows that they are taking this training and that the administrator is okay with that. We need 2 garden leads. And while they don't both have to be school employees, priority is given to teams that apply and at least one person is a school employee. And so they go through their training and they take our school garden sustainability survey, as I mentioned earlier, at the beginning and end of the school year. And this is currently free for now, but actually we've been working with the development team here at UT to monetize this programming. And one of the ways that we're doing that is to recruit potential donors for UT to potentially sponsor a garden. So they would make a donation and pay for the programming so that way the school can continue to participate. And here's an overview of the Sprouting Teachers program. And they've really developed a beautiful curriculum. And we actually worked with McCombs to make the Canvas site really interactive, user-friendly, and also just stunning visually. And so in this training, they complete 6 trainings throughout the school year, and some are in person and some are online via Canvas. And the sessions range from the initial establishment of the garden committee, designating those roles and responsibilities, to getting the planting strategies, working to get that student teacher usage in the garden, and also making plans for how the garden will be maintained over the summertime, right? And I do want to also make a nod to the nonprofit partnership that has helped support this aim. So Big Green donated $60,000 for us to be able to provide $2,000 to 30 teachers 2 years ago, I believe. And then Sprouts Healthy Communities Foundation has continually donated money to support the lab and our work in school gardens. And they've donated almost $2 million to support at this point, and also supports me. And so for my data, I have 2 cohorts, 23, 24 and 24, 25. And I have 35 garden leads who completed our training and got a $2,000 stipend, completed our survey, and 25 that completed the training, but they did not get the stipend. And so for outcome measures and how I did this analysis. So we have those outcomes of interest from the school garden sustainability survey. So their domain rating scores, how they rated physical condition, student teacher experience, community involvement, and resource and support. And then also questions relating to garden work days, garden usage, volunteers, number of trainings, and garden support. And so if they increase their rating or improve their rating from pre to post, they were categorized as improved. Otherwise, if they decrease or stay the same, no improvement. And I ran logistic regression to look at, is stipend associated with greater odds and improvement in these outcomes? And these models are adjusted for Title I status, so that greater than 50% eligible for free or reduced price lunch, as I mentioned earlier, and then garden age. And here's an overview of our sample for our garden leads. So most were teachers or staff from public elementary schools that were not Title I. They reported their garden involvement as being the garden coordinator, and gardens ranged between 6 to 10 years in age. And so I want to highlight some preliminary findings. I'm still working on this analysis. So for the domain rating questions, we only saw significance with student teacher experience. So those who got a stipend had 6 times higher odds to increase or improve their rating of student teacher experience. And then we didn't find significance with other outcomes except for the number of subjects that were taught in the garden. So again, compared to no stipends, those that got a stipend had almost 5 times higher odds of reporting improvement in the number of subjects that were taught in the garden. And so I say this is preliminary because I talked with Dr. Davis, and I have another cohort that's currently going through our garden leadership training for this year, 25, 26. And so I have 18 garden leads that got our training with a stipend who have complete baseline survey data, and 29 without a stipend. And so if everyone does their surveys at the end, and let's hope that they do, I'll be able to increase my sample size. I'll have 53 leads with a stipend and 54 without a stipend, and that'll increase my sample size to 107. And I think this will improve outcomes for the paper. And it's really important, and a lot of people in the garden space are really eager to hear information about the use of stipends. So we figured it'd be better to wait and see if we can improve the sample size and increase our power. And so I do want to highlight some of my presentations and awards that I've been a part of up to this point. So in 2024, I was able to do a main stage lightning talk at the Growing School Garden Summit to over 500 school garden stakeholders, including the executive director of Sprouts Healthy Communities Foundation and the CEO of Sprouts Farmers Market, the grocery store. So that was a wonderful opportunity. And then last February, I received a $1,000 fellowship from Sprouts Healthy Communities Foundation for the work that I've been doing in school gardens. And then this past summer, I did a conference symposium with 2 other Sprouts Impact Grant partners. And so we did a session kind of similar to my talk here about the research behind school gardens and what that actually looks like in practice. So it was a wonderful session that gave more information to researchers or individuals who work in the school garden space to improve their interventions or how they're designing their programming. And I'm also really excited. So I just got the email a couple days ago that I've been invited to be on a panel as a speaker at the 2026 Growing School Garden Summit. So I'll be excited to get that. Yes. So now moving on to what's also currently in the mix, and that is our root study. So many of you have definitely heard about Texas Sprouts. You could probably say the methods yourself, I think, at this point, but you may not have heard of Roots. And so Roots is reaching optimal outcomes for teaching in school gardens. And I want to highlight, again, our nonprofit partnerships for this. So we have Sprouts Healthy Communities Foundation that has donated money for the study, and also Green Our Planet, which is one of the largest hydroponics nonprofits in the United States. And I want to talk a little bit about Green Our Planet. So as I mentioned, they're a school gardening and hydroponics nonprofit, and they essentially contracted our lab to help with their program evaluation to see if their programs are actually working. And their main outcomes are really STEM education and training the next generation of scientists to help address the issues that are currently happening on planet Earth. And so I have a screenshot there of their curriculum. They have really 2 amazing curricula. They have their Garden Connect and Hydro Connect. And one, again, they're stunning, absolutely beautiful, but they have lessons for how you can use gardening and hydroponics from classical STEM applications all the way to financial literacy. And so for our root study, we're looking at the effect of gardening and hydroponics and their combined effects or alone. And I want to talk a little bit about hydroponics versus a standard garden briefly. So hydroponics can produce a greater yield of produce. They can use less water, and you can actually really control the inputs for growth and get really into it, especially from the science teaching aspect. So you can really control how it's growing versus an outside garden where you're sort of subject to whatever pests or elements of weather. They don't take up much space, so they can be stacked vertically. And depending on your skill level, you can pretty much grow anything, anywhere, at any time. So hydroponics can be useful in the sense that for schools where it may not be feasible to have a garden, so say if this is an inner city school where there literally is no land to build a garden, or if it is, it's far away and not close to the school, or also for teachers who probably have no interest in going outside and teaching, but they can have a hydroponics unit that's small, that's in their classroom, and maybe, that's what we're studying now, children can get those same benefits. And so for the root study, we've got 2 sort of broad overarching aims, our effectiveness aim and implementation aim. And I've just got the child level here for effectiveness, but we're looking at environmental attitudes, STEM engagement, nutrition outcomes, social emotional learning. And so my aim 3 for my dissertation is going to come from the change in environmental attitudes and dietary intake. So Roots is a quasi-experimental cluster design. We have 4 groups. We have gardening, hydroponics only, a combination of both, and then a control school. So for our gardening arm, we have 8 schools with an existing school garden, and they get access to Green Our Planet's Garden Connect curriculum. They get the 6 trainings from our garden leader training that we have for sprouting teachers. And we also have a teacher track as well that I not mentioned. So we have teachers that are getting 6 trainings to be able to actually adapt their own curriculum to teach in the garden. Teachers get $100 gift cards from Sprouts, so that way they can purchase cook kits to teach healthy cooking lessons in the classroom. And we have incentives for teachers and administrators who complete our survey. For the hydroponics arm, they get access to the Hydro Connect curriculum. They get 1 large stackable hydroponics unit. And I have pictures on my next slide that'll show, but if you went into gearing at all last year, you probably saw the really giant commercial grade hydroponics unit. So they get 1 like that. And they also get 19 in-classroom hydroponics units. So they get over $12,000 of hydroponics units for free. They get all the seeds and supplies for the initial setup and maintenance. And again, everyone gets those incentives. For our gardening and our hydroponics arm, our combination arm, they get both what the garden arm gets and the hydroponics arm gets. And so here's an example, if you haven't seen, of the large stackable unit. And then in the corner, that's a small desktop unit that can easily fit in a classroom. And then the control schools are delayed and they receive hydroponics the following year. And so here's just an overview of how the study flows. So we have 32 schools and we met this, thankfully. So in the beginning of the year, in August, September, we have all 3rd through 5th grade students, teachers, parents, and administrators complete our baseline survey that I worked painstakingly with our eating lab to develop. And then they get about 9 months of the intervention, so across the school year. And then at the end, they all 3rd through 5th grade teachers, parents, kids, administrators complete our post survey. So just to give you a little idea of what that looks like currently. So right now we have 19 schools that are going through our programming literally now. So we have 5 schools in each of our arms, except for our combination, we've got 4. And what this looks like in terms of numbers. So we've got 5,000 3rd through 5th graders, 5,000 parents, so essentially 1 parent per child, over 280 teachers, and 38 administrators. And I currently manage all of the data for all of those people, all of these people that are in the study currently. So I spend a lot of time looking at Excel and Qualtrics and Google Sheets. So as far as my timeline goes for right now, I'm hoping that my AIM-1 will be in press sometime in 2026. We'll see. I submitted my revisions in September, so we'll come back and see what they say. I plan to finalize data collection for my AIM-3 in May, so we'll be wrapping up roots at the end of this school year. And my AIM-2 manuscript is in progress, but like I said, I'm going to go ahead and wait for this most current cohort of garden lead teachers to wrap up so I can increase my sample size. So my goal would be to submit that by August of 2026, and then pretty much spend the rest of summer and however long writing my AIM-3 and my dissertation with plans to defend in fall of 2026. And as Jamie mentioned, Sprouts and Greener Planet are both very interested in continuing our partnership. And so it may be the opportunity for me to have a postdoc funded, or potentially, this obviously is a way bigger ask, but maybe in the future, maybe even a research scientist position, who knows, but got to speak it into existence and see what happens. But yeah, so references and thank you.